Um, Hi there, my name is Michael Harris. Welcome to Falling Up Radio. I'm so excited to have our guest here today. She's really this incredible master storyteller. We're going to really dive into what that means, not only for your life, perhaps personally, but also if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking to really build and develop your business in a new way, our guest is going to help you. I've got about 5 pages here of notes, so I'm going to do this short little intro, then we'll bring our guest in to talk. So our guest really helps individuals and corporations to really build brands, community, profits, all around the idea of story. Now, a mutual friend of ours who spends $1 million a month or so on average on Facebook ads, I've got to read this, there's so much here, really thought that he had it all figured out at one time. And then he met Kylie and everything changed for him. You know, and Kylie's really rocked my world as well, and she may not really understand or really know that. But one of the things that several years ago, we were on or I was participating in a mastermind that her and another friend were leading, and she recommended I get this book called Winning the Story Wars. And I read this. You can still see I've got all these little notes in it, and it just like really shifted things for me as well. Now, she's really good at inspiring people. And even this Cherokee medicine woman said, hey, girl, you need to get out there and help the world with your knowledge. So there's so much more I can say, but I'll say a little bit. She's worked in the White House. She's run a psychotherapy clinic. You know, and she's like, here she is now, and she's generating just millions of dollars over the years for her clients today. So Kylie Slavik, welcome to Falling Up Radio. I'm super excited you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So tell us, I mean, jumping right in, why does story matter in the world?
I think it's everything, really. So I like to start from the perspective of neuroscience and brain science. And if you look at evolution of the human brain, it literally evolved around a story. So we are hardwired for story. It's the way that the majority of people remember things, like facts and information. A lot of people can't remember it, but a story, almost everybody can remember it. So we're wired to process, learn, and make meaning through story, and therefore it pretty much trickles down through any medium or any field that we could be talking about. Of course, I've spent most of my time talking about business or marketing, but it applies to everything.
Yeah. Well, and I know too that I pulled something off your website, says how chocolate, sex, and stories trigger the same effect in our brain.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
That's about oxytocin, more or less.
Yeah.
So there's only a few things that create oxytocin in the brain.
Yeah.
There's a neuroscientist that I ended up sitting on a boat with, the Staten Island Ferry last year. His name is Paul Zak. He's probably done the most research on oxytocin levels in the brain because he was given a multi-million-dollar grant from DARPA actually to do it. And I'm sure he thought it was really funny that he had a little fangirl on the boat with him, because I don't think neuroscientists get that as much as like Justin Bieber, you know?
Yeah.
But when I found out it was him and he sat down right next to me, I asked him a million questions about it. And yeah, he's done some really cool work, but basically he's measured the spike in oxytocin in the brain when people watch Super Bowl commercials, interestingly enough, the ones that are story-based, and he can predict the sales spikes based off of that. And the thing about oxytocin is that he calls it the moral molecule. That's what I was kind of getting at with bringing him up, is that basically he feels, and what DARPA hired him to investigate was like, can we de-escalate violence? Can we treat each other better? Can we connect more deeply if we all have a little more oxytocin in the brain? Yeah. So it helps us feel happy and feel connected. And, you know, if I feel like if I feel connected to you, I'm much less likely to harm you in some way. And, all this translates to marketing and business too, but it also translates to just having a better human culture.
A better world.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Like talking is important, but also talking with the story and, really historically, and you're probably better at this than I am, but historically, people used to sit around campfires and tell stories and talk and connect, and, ideas and inspiration and stories were passed along verbally, over the years. And I even know, like as a yoga practitioner, yoga teacher, most of my yoga teachers from India, many of them had never written anything down. So the teaching really was passed verbally. And I found that to be so powerful. And I was able to connect with those ideas at a deeper level.
Totally. And there's so many traditions in the world today that have been passed on orally, and people remember it. I remember when I was studying the Vedic literature when I used to live in Florida, there's a really big community of people that study the Vedas, and I would jump into these classes with them and they would say, well, up until 5,000 years ago, they didn't have to write it down. People would just orally recite all, like, and these books are like this, so there's so much of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to ask you too a little bit about your story, how you got started, because, I go back and I look and I see you ran the psychotherapy clinic, you worked in the White House, you did a few different types of things. I wasn't sure whether you were a massage therapist, but somehow you went from, growing up and living this life to getting into storytelling. Can you tell us a little bit about your early journey?
Totally. So the White House and the psychotherapy stuff actually was a client of mine. That's not my background, but that would probably be Gina DeVee. She was a really big client of mine. So there may have just been some places where our info got crossed, but this all really started for me in my early 20s when I was just an artist, and I went to University of Florida. I got an English degree. I actually started out at this really prestigious school in upstate New York for environmental science and forestry. Like, I wanted to save the world and help the earth and help the planet. And then I realized that involved math and science, and my brain doesn't really do that. So, so I dropped out of that pretty quickly. And I thought, I come from a family where the expectation is to go to college, and I went, and I didn't really know what, after the science thing fell through, I didn't really know what to do with myself. I thought, like, I don't really know. I just want to help the planet. So I ended up pursuing a English degree. And when I graduated, and, everyone said, well, what are you going to do with that? And I had no idea. I didn't really think about it. And I ended up in my early 20s living in Gainesville, Florida. It's kind of a little hipster town in north central Florida, getting together with a bunch of people and starting a performance poetry venue in a town that didn't have one. And this was when slam poetry was becoming a really big thing, and people were getting together and competing city to city and national and all this kind of stuff. And so we actually started a poetry venue that didn't have the competition element, but was the same style of, like, really raw, sort of hip hop informed poetry. And we got 200 people in a pretty sleepy little town to come on our opening night. And it was so cool. We spent the next 3-4 years. It continued on after me for a few years. I don't remember how long. And we basically got everybody to come on a Friday night with no alcohol and no drugs, and listen to people share stories from their life.
Wow. Powerful.
Meanwhile, I had no interest in career development. I was working in bars and restaurants and just, like, wanting to be an artist. And, eventually that came to a head, and I realized I also wanted to make money. And we can go in a million directions with this, but to sort of fast forward a bit, I ended up taking that skill of being able to transform the emotional experience of an audience from the poetry venues to the advertising world.
Wow.
I had no idea that would ever happen because I was very anti-corporate and I was very, rebellious and kind of raver punk rockish and like, not really into the establishment in any kind of a way. And then all of a sudden I'm in advertising, and it was a very interesting thing. But now I see the connection between all those different pieces in my life, and it all worked out.
Now, and I know that at some point you were doing some work, and somebody with Deepak Chopra brought you in, and you started working with them.
So it was Max Simon. Around the time that I decided that I needed to make some more money, I ended up going to massage school and doing some work in that world. And, I just wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I liked the healing arts. And so I went to massage school. And what happened was I lived in a town where everybody said, if you want to build a practice, you really need to move, because it's very oversaturated. But I never really had a problem like getting clients or getting people to come to these poetry events or helping other practitioners, fill their workshops and all these types of things. And so not very long after, a lot of different healing schools like acupuncture schools and massage schools were asking me to come in and teach their students. And I started to realize I actually like this better. This is way more fun for me. And I'm making more money, and it's more interesting, and it doesn't hurt my shoulders. And I'm don't really have the constitution for a lot of physical work. And so what ended up happening was I really got excited about that side of things. And I started following all these different conscious business leaders. And Max Simon is the son of Dr. David Simon, who's no longer alive. And he was the silent partner and co-founder of the entire Chopra empire. Yeah. And so Max actually built the Chopra Center product line like 21 years old, right out of college. And he's a super genius marketer. And so one day I got an email from him. I was on his email list. He was looking for a content manager. I didn't really have the skill set at that point in terms of, being a really experienced content person, but I had the determination and the craziness to be able to get that job out of hundreds and hundreds of people. And that really opened up my world. Max mentored me, and he introduced me to a lot of really powerful entrepreneurs like Mark Victor Hansen and John Assaraf and Bob Proctor. And those were the people that, babysat him when he was a kid. Like he just that was just his world. So that really helped me to kind of get over my younger years of thinking that business was bad, because now I'm on the phone with these guys and Mark is telling me, oh, I want to end world hunger, things like that. And it completely changed my perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you went to work, was it for Max or for Deepak or?
For Max.
Yeah. Yeah.
He had a training company in the conscious business space. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great, and I know like Bob Proctor and Gay Hendricks and John Assaraf and a lot of these people as well. And it's fascinating to me that you were able to jump into that world at one point doing content. And was that all around story and storytelling at that point?
I was interviewing all those guys on one thing that works in their business that nobody else knew about, and turning it into blog content. And so I was just talking to all the conscious business leaders, people like Ariel Ford and, Mark, and I can't even remember all the people, but I interviewed about 30 or 40 of them, and we turned it into blog content. And then Max moved me into being his affiliate manager. So I ended up being more of a relationships person at that point. But it was a really, it was basically going from the bars and the massage tables to talking to those guys on a daily basis. So it was quite interesting.
So that's a huge leap. But I love those type of stories and those ideas where we kind of like have this shift that goes on. And sometimes I like to call it shape shifting or quantum leaps even. And I look back and I realize even in nature, how much nature teaches us about shape shifting and quantum leaps.
Totally.
Even like one day it can be sunny and then 7 seconds later it can be absolute pouring. To me, that's shape shifting. That's a change in nature. And it demonstrates, I feel, as a human being, that we can have those shape-shifting moments too, that we can go from one state to another, essentially instantaneously.
That's such a good way to describe it, because that's what was required in that moment, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Now, where did you really dive more into what I'm going to call storytelling? Maybe you describe it a little bit different, but this idea of story in business and how critical it is.
Well, what happened was very shortly after Max had an affiliate partner, Gina, the woman who did work for the White House, and her and I just really hit it off. I was managing Max's launch, and her and I just really connected and hit it off. And she asked me if I'd manage one of her launches, and during that time, she also just casually asked if I wanted to try out running some Facebook ad campaigns. And I had no idea how to do that, but I was at that point very much unpersuaded by what I didn't know, you know? So this is one way to say it. So I just said yes, and I taught myself how to run Facebook ad campaigns in just a couple of days. The platform was much simpler then. I don't know if that's even possible to do nowadays, but you know, it was a good 7 years ago. So I didn't have experience as a advertising copywriter or a marketing person. I wrote some blog posts for Max and I did the poetry stuff, but I wrote, and I kind of sat her down and just asked her, what is it that you really want to be known for? And what is it that you really like? What's the story that you want to tell people? And she told me, and I told this story in an ad. And the first weekend the ad ran, we spent something like $600 to make 70 grand. And so she couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And that launch went on and did $2.5 million in 12 weeks. But what was more extraordinary than that is that when I asked everybody that purchased, you know, she gave me permission to ask and to do some research so we could figure out why it was working. And what they all told me was, like, you could have sold anything, but it was really the story that sold us. Like, we just wanted to be a part of that story. So from then on, I focused almost entirely on story. I realized if I'm teaching people launch strategy, if I'm teaching Facebook ads, I have to, like, those are structures, they're mechanical. And whether or not they work is determined by how good the story is. That's my belief today. And I've seen this in hundreds of niches and hundreds of times. I mean, you could follow a webinar funnel or a PLF launch sequence to a T, but if there's no substance in it, it's like it's not like just throwing up a webinar or throwing up a few videos is effective. It's really the story that's being told throughout that makes it work or not work.
Yeah. And to all the listeners out there, I hope you got a notepad and you're taking notes, because it's so great to have Kylie here. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Kylie, based on what you just said about that importance of that story, is what are the basic elements in a story that are necessary to really stand out?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, there's quite a few, but I'll try to just give you a few. Sure. The first is that the story is typically about a person. So there has to be a character, whether that's you or a client or somebody that you know. There has to be something. And, you know, if you're Geico and you want to make a lizard story, that's great. But most of the time we're talking about a human. And, you know, in film, they would call that the hero.
Well, I mean, if I can stop you there, because you mentioned the Geico, like Progressive Insurance has, I can't remember her name, but, you know, they've done this for years now, and she's like the attractive character, so to speak.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So typically, we're going to have a human character. But if you want to go outside of that box, you're welcome to. But it's not my area of expertise. So what we need to establish with that character, that hero, that whatever you want to call it, is a sense of likability and relatability.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch a film, you're going to see that happen in the first 15 minutes. Like, you either like the person that the movie is about or you don't. And if you don't, you're probably not going to be interested in what happens in their life, which is usually what the movie's about.
Yeah.
So that's the first element of good storytelling, is a character that your audience will connect with on one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second thing that we need is conflict, because again, to look at film as an easy example, the first 15, 20 minutes of a movie, we're usually seeing a person in their just everyday life. And it's allowing us to establish this likability. But then about that 15, 20-minute mark, something pretty serious happens. And now we're on the edge of our seat. Like, how's this person going to resolve this? Like, maybe they lose a job, maybe they lose a partner, maybe they get stuck on an island or the plane crashes. But there has to be some level of conflict or suspense. And that's basically what drives the rest of the plot, is like, okay, we like this dude or this woman. Now something happened that we don't like, right? That's what the brain is doing. Oh my God, no, I don't want this to happen to this person because I like them. And now the rest of the time is spent going, how are they going to get out of it? You know, what's going to happen? How are they going to resolve this?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the third element that I'll give you for today, is we need to have a resolution of that. We have to show what actually happens, which is the plot, and how does, to take it one step deeper, and I think a lot of people miss this in business, not in screenwriting, but in business, and that is, what was the actual internal transformation that the character had to go through in order to resolve the conflict?
Mm-hmm.
A good example of this is in the genre of romance. Usually we see a man or a woman liking somebody, and oftentimes who they like is unattainable. And as they go through the process of trying to get the person, they become so different that they end up falling in love with the person on the sidelines who was in love with them the whole time, that they never would have noticed because they were too shallow, but now they're connected to their heart. So the real story is like, oh, I've gone from being superficial and only wanting the cheerleader to like me so I'm popular, and I had such a change of heart and got to know myself so well that now I like this other girl that I didn't even notice in the beginning. That's where we really fire off emotionally.
Wow. And so what I'm hearing is really that's real life.
Yeah,
We're
totally.
connecting to people in these stories because they remind us of us.
Totally.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you're like focus say on a brand, and one of the things that I liked about in the mastermind that I participated in with you, and some of the materials there, and some of what our friend Mike has put out, even like those old Dove commercials or those Dodge commercials, and like they were telling the story of a farmer. They didn't even say anything about the truck, but you could, feel for the farmer.
Totally. It's so true. Yeah. Exactly. And some other ones that come to mind are like Nike and Apple. They do such a good job with brand storytelling. I don't know if there's anyone in the world. Well, Patagonia does a really good job too. I mean, there's some iconic brands that have been harnessing the power of story for a very long time. But if you think about what Apple's been able to create, for example, which is really almost a cult of personality. Like, it's a phone, but people relate to it almost like it's a person. And it's because they've told this story of, this is what I perceive it as. I don't necessarily hear other people talk about it in this way, but I see Apple's brand storytelling as harnessing the angst of the artist and the creative. In the 70s and the 80s, if you were an artist or a creative, the reaction, at least in the States, was like, well, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
and that you should be a lawyer, you should be a doctor, you should go into something smart. And what Apple did was say, actually, you weirdo artist people, we're going to give you the tools to experience your power expressed in the world and to see your ideas come alive and to see your creativity valued financially and otherwise.
Yeah.
And what happened is now you have people lining up and sleeping outside of the Apple store to get the next phone when it's not even that different than the other phone that they already have.
Yeah. Well, it's like Apple's always had that rebellious streak to it, and
Totally.
early on throwing rocks at IBM, saying, big bad IBM, we're the rebels, we stand alone,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
They've taken that mavericky energy and said, you can be powerful, have money, feel important, you can be part of. And every artist I know, every internet marketer that I know, every filmmaker, every musician, they are using Apple products.
Yeah.
Then we see banks and schools and airplanes and the military on PC.
There's my iPhone.
Totally. Me too.
Yeah. I switched over at one point from PC to Mac, and I actually bought a PC laptop a couple of years ago, and I used it for about 6 weeks, and that's about it. And I went and bought another Mac.
The Apple really, also the design too, it's like it makes more sense to an artist brain.
Yeah.
It really does. The other computers are really good for engineers and architects. But so Apple didn't try to get the market, they didn't try to get the entire market, but they went really hard for the market they wanted. And now they were the first $1 trillion American company.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. And, I said they line up at the store, and all these pre-sales, and they're just waiting and waiting and waiting for the new 10 or 10X or whatever it is. And there isn't much difference.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I've gone through the upgrades. There's not much difference.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a little different color or something. But
Totally.
So I want to ask you a little bit more. I did this storytelling workshop a number of years ago through Marylhurst College. And it was more surrounding, stage work and talking about more like mythology kind of stuff. Like I talked a lot about Menehunes in Hawaii and the stories around that. And in hindsight, and having worked with you a little bit and reading the Story Wars book, I went back and I looked at that and really thought, wow, that process of telling that story, like about the Menehunes and the attractive character and who they were throwing the rocks at and how it was resolved and all of that is really similar. So like coming back to that idea of history and historically sitting around the campfire, this process is really ingrained with us. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's different ways of expressing it, and there's different forms that it will come out in different places, but it's all kind of the same thing.
Yeah. And so is that why, like in the marketing world, when you're using story, is that why we connect so much? Is because it's just like ingrained in us at a genetic, biological level?
I definitely think it is. I think there's a lot of science that would agree with me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's hard. It's harder to disprove than it is to prove.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So tell me, this is Falling Up Radio, and what is it in like the last 20 years or so, or maybe it's not 20 years, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's, 25 years, 30 years. What is it that perhaps is something that you might be willing to discuss that really triggered something? Maybe it was a challenge, maybe you had lost all your money, maybe it was something that caused that shift. All of us have had multiple shifts, but is there something that comes to mind that's pertinent to our discussion today?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. One of the things I can say is that in my earlier years, I struggled a lot with addiction and alcoholism. And when we created that poetry venue and that poetry community, part of it was that we were a bunch of young 20-year-olds trying to explore this idea that maybe creativity was a possible solution in terms of recovery, and maybe people have a lot they need to express, and that could help. Not that it's the only thing we need to do, but that it could be a part of it. And so I think that had I not had that problem, that struggle, that sort of like almost dying a million times kind of lifestyle,
Yeah.
I probably would have never been so passionate in the arts in the first place.
Wow.
So it really brought me to my knees enough to bring all this other stuff, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm of the feeling, and even like my book, Falling Down, Getting Up. I mean, it's all about really this idea that often, or maybe always, I'm going to say often to always, something happens in our life that we're challenged by at a deep level. You know,
Totally.
maybe financial, relationship, addiction, whatever it is,
Yeah.
that triggers us, that creates a shape-shifting event into this new reality to be able to move forward. But the only way to get there is to go through that.
Totally.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a story without adversity. Sometimes I call it the opposing force in the story, and that opposing force could be internal or external, you know?
Yeah.
Talking about something like addiction, it's a really clear opposing force, and it's very internal. And so it's like anti-life inside of me, you know? So like if my biology is geared towards survival and living, and then there's something in me that's going in the other direction, that's clearly an opposing force. An opposing force can also be an army coming in and taking over, right? But we always have to there's not really a story without it.
Yeah.
There's just not. I used to argue with my mentors. I hired some Hollywood screenwriting studio consultants to teach me the form. And I would argue with them that there had to be conflict. I'm like, no, we could still have a story with no conflict. We could just inspire everybody. And I finally, after a couple of years of that, I started to see that maybe I just didn't understand what conflict really meant. So
Yeah. But, you know, there's I like some documentary movies. In the movie, I don't know whether you saw it or not, it came out on Monday, The Game Changers. You know, James Cameron did it. It's all about plant-based eating and these high-level athletes that switch from a traditional meat and dairy-based diet to a plant-based diet.
Oh, wow.
And how their performance soared as a result of doing that. So, you know, James Cameron being such a filmmaker, he really took that attractive character, created conflict, you know, the whole conflict around what should you eat, what shouldn't you eat, all of that kind of stuff, what friends say and marketing says, and there's a lot of conflict there. And then what happens as a result of them doing it. So I from what I learned from you, especially a couple of years ago, you know, it still is in me, and I still see this process, and it's like over and over and over, some of these things that I never saw before are now visible. If that makes sense. Yeah.
It's so cool, and it really is everywhere. And I think that Jonah Sachs, who wrote the Story Wars that you held up earlier, Winning the Story Wars, he talks about this in such a beautiful way and breaks the process down. He worked with a woman who wanted to bring attention to something similar, factory farming. And nobody wanted to hear about it. You know, no one wants to hear about it. And so he showed how we can take these really complex and very, very hard to listen to ideas, and we can make them, we can put them in a form where people hear it, share it, get it, spread it, by just adding that characterization. And so he came up with an idea called the Matrix. And they used the characters from the Matrix So they had Neo, but they called it something else, Leo, I think. And they turned them into pigs and cows, and basically they created this adventure sci-fi story that shows us what happens on a factory farm, because then people can take it in.
Yeah.
And it had like 200 million downloads and got translated into hundreds of languages.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so fascinating, because otherwise we could say, hey, everybody, listen to me. I have this flyer about factory farming. And everybody goes, I got something else to think about right now. You know?
Yeah. So really, this idea of story is really everywhere. I mean, it's in politics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one politician throwing rocks, to the other one and saying, hey, I'm the attractive character.
Mm-hmm.
This is why.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it happens in our family, that even in interpersonal relationships go, you know, hey, I was really struggling with this, and then my brother or sister or mom or dad, whatever, they were a big bad wolf and they wouldn't let me do it. Or, you know, I mean, I could go on and on and on. But it's intertwined in our life as human beings.
Totally.
Yeah. So we've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes left at this point. Are there some additional simple ideas, maybe a couple, 2, 3 simple ideas that the listener could potentially take, especially if they're like an entrepreneur or they're trying to figure out something that they could do to maybe get story in, or maybe tweak stories that they already have?
Totally. So the first thing is to really, really know who you're speaking to. I can share the story around the Facebook ad that I did with a group of healers. And I would emphasize the aspects of me that were really resistant to business and things of that nature, because it's more relevant to them. But if I was speaking to digital marketers who just cared about numbers, I would focus on the part of the story that was about the click cost and the return and all of that kind of stuff, right? So it's like, know who you're speaking to, because you can tweak the same story in many, many, many ways, but make sure that the people that are listening, that the way you share it actually matters to them and addresses things that are keeping them up at night, you know?
Yeah.
So that's the first little thing. And I think a lot of us miss it because it's so basic, you know?
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to share it.
Yeah.
The second I kind of already mentioned, and that's really like identifying the conflict. So if you're an entrepreneur, the best place to look for conflict in the story is the difference between, or the gap between, what your clients want in their life and why they don't actually have it. So there's got to be a reason if they say they want it and they don't have it. And we probably are dealing with people or serving people that have tried to find solutions to this problem and they still haven't. That's really the conflict you want your stories to center on.
So let me ask you something, and I don't know if this question really makes sense. I guess it makes sense, but I don't know the answer to it. So you mentioned number one, you mentioned number two, and that conflict. I mean, could you say something in marketing as simple as, you know, I'll take the yoga studios, for example, in their marketing and attracting new students, it might be something like, you may not have the health that you want. What are you doing to get it now? Or here is a way to get it now. Is that, I mean, can you be as simple as that, as a sentence or two?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can tell a whole story in one sentence.
Wow.
Absolutely. I've done it. I have to do it in Facebook ad headline copy, especially.
Yeah.
Like we have to basically show the before and after, or the sort of where we are now in the destination in that one split second. So you definitely could.
So when you're talking about story, it doesn't necessarily mean a whole book. Like I just heard you say, maybe one sentence.
Totally. And if you and I guess we can make that into the third tip, because it came up organically. And it's like, if you're an entrepreneur, then you're sending emails, you're making social media posts, you're probably doing things like that at the most basic of level. And so in your subject lines or in your, you can put a headline at the top of a social media post where it kind of shows that before, after, or that from this to this, where you're building an intrigue and you're showing the beginning of the story, that there's a conflict and that the conflict gets resolved all in one sentence. Which, and if I'd thought about it, I would have brought some examples, but that's a really powerful way for people to say, oh, I have that problem, I want that solution. Now you've just sold me on reading the rest of this email because I want to know what happens, right?
Well, even like Nike, if I'm understanding what you're saying right, 3 words, just do it, is really a story in itself.
Totally. Oh,
Yeah.
it's such a story.
Yeah. I mean, it might be, just do it. It might be, oh God, I got to get out there and walk. Yeah, I just want to just do it. Or I really want to, hike more. I really want to do more yoga, whatever it might be, that it addresses a conflict and it addresses a resolution.
Totally.
Yeah. And so that's what you're talking about.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
However you get there, just get there. So it could be a paragraph, it could be 7 words, it could be 3 words, like you just demonstrated. Yeah.
And I've also heard, that even though we're talking about 1 or 2 sentences in the marketing world, and say in the email marketing world, and landing pages, oftentimes you'll get these landing pages that are forever. They're like 10 pages long, 15 pages long.
Totally.
Yet maybe the first headline was really all that was needed.
Mm-hmm.
But you still go through this whole process.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually interesting because I like that approach, because some people are fact people and they just want to know, what am I getting if I opt in? They just want to read that headline and those bullets and opt in. And so you do that at the top and you give them a box right there, right? And then for the people that need more, you give them the story underneath the information and another box at the bottom. Actually find that works really, really well for different types of people.
Yeah. So it's just like you get that emotional reaction initially.
Yeah.
And then you, like, for the people that want to read it all, you add all that other information, and that helps them confirm perhaps that is something that they want to do or buy or participate in, however you want to frame it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. This has really been fascinating. I wish we had about 5 more hours to be able to do this, but every time that I've talked to you, I've learned something, and it's like our friend Mike said, even though he spends $1 million a month or so on ads and thought he knew everything, when he talks to you, it changed everything.
Aw, Mike's such a good guy.
Yeah, no doubt. And so I feel really blessed, and I learned, and I learn more, and I always go back and listen, because sometimes here I am, I'm trying to create this conversation between the guest on the show and myself, and I'm kind of thinking in one mode, and then I go back and listen and I take notes, and it's just like I hear so much more than what I heard initially.
Yeah, it's multi-layered, isn't it?
Yeah, it totally is. So where can somebody find you if they want to reach you?
The best place is my website or Facebook, which you can find just with my name, Kylie Slavik.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you spell that for the listeners on Apple?
It's KYLIESLAVIK.
Great. .com.
.com, yes.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate too, if you're not watching on YouTube the video or on the website at fallingupradio.com, and you're listening to Stitcher, iHeart, or Apple, or one of the other platforms, if you're just listening to the audio, if you go to fallingupradio.com and you go to Kylie Slavik's page, you'll see additional information there about her, as well as the show notes that we will have in there as well. And you'll see that the links. So if you can't remember Kylie's name or how to spell it, come to the website, Falling Up Radio, and you can see her episode page and how to contact her and all the other information that you might need at this point. And I want to tell you, too, as a listener, if you're listening, again, go back and re-listen. If you didn't have a notepad, go back and take notes, because what Kylie shared with us was really incredible, talking about the history of storytelling, why we connect with story, how to create story, how to use it not only personally, but perhaps in your marketing as a business owner, whether you're small or large, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're writing Facebook ads or email campaigns, it doesn't matter. Go back and take another listen and share this with your friends, regardless of where you are. Share this. If you're listening to this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss additional additional episodes that we have coming up. We'll probably have issues in there too, but they'll be all in the episodes. So anyway, Kylie, it's been wonderful again to have you. I want to keep asking, you got any final words? You got anything else you want to share that we haven't touched on?
I think the final word would just be to trust that people really do want to hear your story. A lot of times entrepreneurs don't believe that. They think they just want to know about the product. They just want to know about them. And it is true that they do just want to hear about them. And we are taught that in marketing, but they can see themselves through you so much more, right? So it's this beautiful opportunity to serve them, to know themselves better. And so if you're hesitating and thinking, I don't have a story or nothing's interesting about me, I just want to challenge you on that a little bit. And that's what I always love to leave people with.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And again, it's been just a treat to have you here. And I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to be here with us. And so thank you very much. And thank you for all that you do in the world, not only in your work and your business, but also your personal life and what your intentions are. So I think that's huge. And, the why behind what we do, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's just been such a pleasure to spend this time with you today, too.
Yeah. So thank you again. Be sure to share this with all your friends, regardless of where you're listening to it, and talk to you soon.